Welcome to the Beyond Atheism podcast, with me, Nathan Alexander, and my co-host, Todd Tavares. Moving beyond questions of God's existence, this podcast asks, what's next in a world without God? If you're enjoying the show so far, make sure to like and subscribe, rate and review, and consider supporting us on Patreon.
So far on the podcast, we've discussed some of the alternatives to religious service that have developed in opposition to religious authority and tradition. We've heard about those that were created in the Soviet Union and persist until today, as well as the intentional rituals of the Satanic Temple. Today, we're looking at another alternative, the Sunday Assembly. An atheist, we aren't sure exactly. To talk about this in more detail, we're joined by someone who has researched the Sunday Assembly. We're joined today by Jacqui Frost, Postdoctoral Research Fellow in the Department of Sociology and the Religion and Public Life program at Rice University. Jacqui's research focuses on the causes and consequences of religious disaffiliation in the United States, and she is working on a book about the ways non-religious people sacralize science in secular congregations. Jacqui, welcome to Beyond Atheism.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Jacqui, for taking the time to talk with us. Just to get started, maybe I can ask, what is your own religious background and how did you get into studying secularism?
Yeah, definitely. So I grew up in a very religious home in rural Wyoming, and I was homeschooled for religious reasons. So very sort of evangelical, non-denominational type space. And as I got older, I sort of grew away from that space and went to college, and sort of happened into a sociology of religion class. I actually went to college to study journalism, but I was in a sort of freshman, I don't know, in the US, a lot of the sort of freshman classes, you get put into like a set of classes that you go with a bunch of the same people through the same set of classes. So I was sort of randomly put into an intro to sociology class and kind of fell in love with it. So I was just taking random sociology classes while I was getting my journalism degree, and took a sociology of religion class, and just really it kind of changed my life in that I'd never really thought about religion that way, or thought about like, well, maybe we had made this all up. And I was like, oh, cool. I didn't really think that I could sort of make a career out of thinking about what religion means. So I started thinking about that. And then I took a year off between undergrad and grad school, and I was planning to be a journalist. But in that year off, I found myself reading sociology, reading a lot of sociology of religion stuff. I was sort of looking into the new atheists at that time. That was sort of a couple years after Christopher Hitchens and those guys had been writing their books. And so I was reading those books. And I thought, I could study atheism in sociology. That seems like an interesting sort of intersection of my interests here. So I applied to grad programs and people were interested. So that's sort of how that started. And then I did my master's project looking at how atheists were responding to new atheist literature, because I was reading it and I was like, yeah, some of this is resonating, but not all of it. And so I wanted to see how other everyday atheists were responding to some of the scripts that some of these sort of atheist public figures were putting out there. And a lot of the people I interviewed were like, I'm for these sort of politicized atheist spaces, but I'm really looking for an atheist community, like somewhere to sort of make friends. And so that's what sort of got me interested in the Sunday Assembly, and studying what an atheist community might look like.
Well, I mean, that's an amazing story. I mean, you fell pretty hard. That sounds like a radical change. And then it leads you into the Sunday Assembly. And now, like, as you heard in the intro, like, I'm not really sure what to call it, because it sounds like it gets dangerously close to atheist churches. And that also kind of sounds like it's recreating religion, especially if we start to bring in things like, when you start having rituals and spirituality. So, first of all, as a sociologist, how do you differentiate the two? What makes this an atheist congregation? How is it separate from religion? Or is
Yeah.
this something, is it wrong to even think about them in these sort of categories?
Yeah. So, yeah, I have a number of thoughts on that. So, firstly, I think the atheist church language is something that the Sunday Assembly did put out themselves at first. and the conversations around that, at least in the chapters that I was studying. So, for the listeners who don't know, Sunday Assembly is an organization with, 40 chapters across the US and the UK. And I really focused on one chapter of the Sunday Assembly for my project. And in that chapter, a lot of the discussion was, well, we're not all atheists here. There's agnostics, there's sort of the nominally non-religious, and they don't necessarily like the language of church. They like sort of congregation or assembly more than church, but they did feel that the atheist church language sort of helped in sort of media presentations because it was sort of clickbaity and people would get interested in that way. But whether or not it's religion is definitely a question I get a lot and that people are thinking about. I'd like to think about that question in terms of one, I don't think we should be thinking of everything that people use to make meaning as being religious, right? So that you can kind of go in a rabbit hole of everything's religious if we start doing that, right? So if every ritual is religious, then like the baseball game is religious.
Right.
So we have to draw a line somewhere for sure. But I'm also, I am trying to get a way of sort of asking, is it religion or not religion, right? So there's a lot of scholars who are thinking about different sort of bigger umbrella categories that we can put both religion and non-religion under, like worldviews or existential cultures is a term that people are using. So thinking about the fact that every human, I won't say every human, most humans are trying to make meaning out of their lives, and they're interested in community spaces. People ritualize different aspects of their lives in non-religious ways a lot of times. So thinking about both atheism or non-religion, whatever term you want to use there, and religion as being two worldviews or two existential cultures that sort of vary in how they use supernatural beliefs to make meaning, but they can draw on a lot of the same sort of resources.
And so what did your research of the Sunday Assembly look like? I mean, in terms of like, were you like becoming sort of a member of the congregation, or how did that work exactly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually got lucky because I was in a grad research methods class the year that the Sunday Assembly was founded, and I had to go out and do like a practice ethnography for that class. And I had been seeing in the news that Sunday Assembly had started in London, is where it was founded, and that there was individual chapters sort of popping up in the U.S. And so I just Googled to see if there was a chapter in the city I was living in, and they were having a sort of meetup to talk about creating a chapter. So I went to that meeting for my class project and sort of gauged their interest in sort of me potentially doing my project on them and sort of being a part of their community in that way. And they were very interested. As I'm sure you know, most non-religious people are pretty pro-science, pretty pro-research. They were pretty excited about the idea of, being in a book, being in journal articles. So it was cool because I got to get in sort of on the ground level and sort of watch them create this whole thing from scratch. And so what that looked like sort of on the weekly basis was, obviously I attended they only had monthly services. So once a month they had a Sunday service, but especially that first year they had 2 to 3 organizing meetings a week. And so they had about 8 to 10 people that were sort of on the ground level of trying to get this thing started. And so I was going to a lot of those meetings and was taking notes, and eventually they were like, could you be the minutes taker for us for these meetings, because you're taking all these notes and no one else is. So I ended up being basically the secretary of their organizational meetings for about 3 years.
3 years? Wow.
Yeah, so I did, my project was for 3 years. I did sort of ethnographic observations for 3 years. And so my role was very much, I was in a lot of ways part of the organizing team, in that I was going to those meetings. I was, they often asked me to sort of help out setting up, help out sort of greeting people. But it was, it's interesting because as a researcher, you don't have to, but I was, wanting to keep some distance in terms of, they were definitely creating new friend groups. They're inviting each other to weddings and things like that. And that wasn't necessarily something I was a part of. I wasn't developing the friendships in the same way. I was sort of intentionally being the researcher. So that was interesting in terms of navigating those relationships. I remember one time they they were very aware of my role as like a researcher and a student, and I didn't have a car at the time, and I was struggling to make all their meetings. So they were sort of outside of the city that I was in, and they offered to give me a car, and I was like, I don't think that should happen, but thank you, because
Right.
they're all about, their whole thing is creating community and sort of building these networks of people, and it was interesting because I couldn't, I didn't really want to be, gain the benefits of that in the way that, if that makes sense, because
Yeah.
so it was an interesting process to navigate, but they were very open and welcoming and very interested in the process.
I mean, so methodologically, I'm super interested because it's not just I want to know both of the findings, the ethnography and the sort of like time series. So I guess like what can you tell us about the initial ethnography of the people there? So meaning like, the age, gender, race, background of the people, what you found there, and can you feed that into how it changed over time?
Definitely. Yeah. So in general, like in terms of demographics, it's a fairly white space, at least in the US, or in the spaces that the chapters that I visited. A lot of sort of former Christian people, or I would say there's a decent mix of people who are sort of formally religious and people who were never religious but felt like they had missed out on something by never going to church, and they saw this as like their opportunity of doing that. But definitely the former religious were usually former Christians, so there weren't a lot of like former Muslims, for example, in this space. So fairly white former Christian space. The age range was pretty wide, but I'd say majority like 30s to 40s professionals were going. A decent amount of families interested in bringing their kids and sort of developing a sort of like, secular Sunday school. A lot of the chapters were interested in that. And so at the chapter that I studied, the turnover was pretty high at first. So they would get, 60 to 70 people would come each month, but each month that 60 is only about half of the people were the same as the previous month. And so to me, that really meant that like there is a lot of interest in spaces like this. And there was also a big sort of media campaign around this. So there was certainly some people just sort of coming to see what it was all about and maybe not super invested. But I think, there's a lot of interest among non-religious people in finding community spaces, that are explicitly secular. And I think, Sunday Assembly is a very specific version of that, and that, it resonated with some people more than others. So there was, a pretty high amount of turnover at first, but then it sort of settled into a pretty stable set of about 50 people, about 8 of which were the organizers, I would say.
What does a service look like exactly? Like, is there,
Mm.
I guess there's singing and like maybe a
Mhm.
sermon or something like that?
Mm. Yeah, so the services, so the Sunday Assembly was founded in London in 2013, and they sort of set out sort of here's the sort of order or the types
Mhm.
of things that a Sunday Assembly should have in their service in order to be a Sunday Assembly. And those included definitely the collective singing. That's a big piece of it. And they're typically singing pop songs. Um, so like at the chapter that I studied, the big sort of the song that we sang every month was Where Everybody Knows Your Name from the Cheers show. I don't know if you're
Mm,
familiar.
mm.
The theme song from Cheers.
Uh-huh.
They felt that that was like a good sort of representation of what they were trying to do, like build a community where
Mm.
everybody knows your name.
Mhm.
But lots of like, I don't know, they would often like tweak lyrics of songs to be more secular. Um,
God.
for example, like there was a big debate. So they wanted to sing the Rainbow Connection from the Muppets.
Yep.
And there's one line in there that says like it's probably magic. And so there was a big debate among the organizers as to whether or not they should use that line in the song.
Yeah.
So that's just like one example of many debates that were had about like what sort of song is to be singing and what lyrics are appropriate. So singing is a big piece of it. They usually sing 3 to 4 songs a service, usually start with one, end with one, and there's 2 in the middle. Another big piece is, so they didn't have sermons. They typically would invite an outside person to come give more of like a TED Talk style talk. In the chapter that I focused on, usually it was a researcher from a local college. So lots of like people in sort of both the hard and soft sciences. So a lot of like people studying sort of planetary science was a big thing. A lot of the Sunday assemblers I talked to were really interested in space exploration. But they also had, like community leaders come in. There was a week that we learned about creating chicken coops. There was a week we learned about sort of homelessness in the city. So a lot of sort of science talks, social justice type presentations were typically what the topics were about. And then so the singing and the sort of TED talk were the main features, but there also usually was a short reading. And most of the services were pretty thematized. So we would have a week on a service on homelessness, and that's what the talk was about. A lot of the song lyrics were about finding homes or whatever it might be. They would have a reading from someone who wrote about this or a poem about that. And then they struggled with the name of this, but there is a piece of the service where someone from the community, from the Sunday assembly, comes up to talk about something that they learned. So they used to call it One Thing I Do Know. So it's kind of like here's what I learned, and in the spirit of always sort of questioning your beliefs and sort of figuring out how you learn as you go. And then at the end of the service, there was sort of a quiet moment. Often they will put I'm saying this in the past because I researched this organization a few years ago, but they are still actively doing this. They put, a quote up from something related to what we learned that month. And we all sort of sat and quietly sort of reflected on everything we learned in the service. And then there's usually cookies and coffee afterwards where people would sort of socialize.
Wow, that's fantastic. All right,
Yeah.
so this structure came from London. But
Yes.
there's no hierarchical connection to one assembly to London or to between any of the other assemblies.
For the most part, no. So there is sort of an international. Um, there's like 2 or 3 paid staff members at sort of the top of the organizational level that are sort of branding type things. They do a yearly conference where various Sunday Assembly chapters will come and meet and sort of rejuvenate their interests and talk about problems they're having, things like that. I went to one of those conferences a few years ago. So they do have a couple paid staff members that are, helping run the organization as a nonprofit. It is a nonprofit organization, but the local chapters don't have any paid staff or anything like that. It's all volunteer based. It's non-hierarchical on the local chapter level, in that there's no singular leader or pastor type figure in any of these spaces. The founder, there are 2 co-founders of the Sunday Assembly. They're both comedians in the UK. But one of them, one man and one woman, Sanderson Jones and Pippa Evans. And Pippa sort of was a part of it for the first few years, but she eventually stepped down. And Sanderson Jones does sort of have he has a commanding presence. He's a comedian. He's very sort of charismatic. So he often speaks for the Sunday Assembly, I would say. But he doesn't have any sort of hierarchical power over what other Sunday assemblies are doing or anything like that.
So, I mean, this is for us. One of the things we've noticed is that there seems to be in atheism this rejection of that sort of the rigid hierarchy that churches produce, and this doesn't seem to have it. How did they, at the local level, did they have like administration and like a hierarchy or subordinate roles? How did the organizers, how did that group function in terms of, I mean, because it sounds like this is pretty much an autonomous group that if anybody wanted to start one, they would be free to do so themselves. If anybody wanted to become part of this, was it that fluid where people could sort of come in and come out?
Sort of. So there was an accreditation process with the larger international organization. So if you want to be a Sunday assembly, you do have to reach out to them. And, I can't remember the stipulations, but you have to have a certain amount of services already in place. And then someone from an accredited assembly will come to your assembly and sort of, they did this in the chapter I was observing. They have sort of a list of questions about, are all of the pieces of the service there? I don't remember what the other stipulations were, but there is sort of a process in terms of to be called a Sunday assembly, you do have to eventually, join that sort of international organization in sort of with paperwork. So you can't just, be a Sunday assembly on your own and not tell them. But beyond that, like I think the local chapters felt a lot of freedom to do whatever they wanted to do. They if they got to pick the songs, they didn't necessarily have to have a reading or whatever it might be. They could sort of tweak that. In terms of the organizers, there was some structure. It's a nonprofit, so to be a nonprofit, they had to have a president, a vice president, a treasurer. And so those were just sort of the people that had stepped up to start the chapter that I observed, sort of just divvied up those tasks. And the idea was to sort of rotate people in and out of them very often so that the president wasn't, the president all the time. And the president role was not sort of the person that was like always standing up in front of the congregation by any means. They would rotate the host of the assemblies. So the president was really just sort of on paper. Although, the person that was president when I was there, she definitely did a lot of the organizing work, but she wasn't, pushing her specific agenda onto that chapter or anything like that. So mostly the bureaucracy of it was for the nonprofit purposes.
Now, is this something that's communicated in? Now I think what I'm trying to ask is getting nuanced and complicated, and mostly difficult for me to ask. But because one of the things I have these terrific memories of Catholic Mass, and basically, being lectured. My favorite memory is being the priest just telling us, you're all sinners, right? You're all bad people, and you need to obey God, right? And it's pretty overt, right? Like it's this straight line. We've got God at the top, and this message is coming down through the chain of command. Do they ever? I mean, is it something that's communicated that you can have these sort of fluid power dynamics that people who, once they've been there for a while, ought to be able to move in and move out of the organizing?
I think, yeah, definitely. So the best sort of data I have on how all of that was communicated was as I was part of the organizing team of the chapter that I studied, I was put on the email listserv where all Sunday Assembly chapters were sort of talking to each other, and the founders would weigh in on big debates. And my understanding of everyone's sort of discussions there was this should be as non-hierarchical as possible. It should be, a lot of the language they use in their charter is that they are radically inclusive, in that they want everyone to feel that they can participate, even religious people, if that, if they so choose, that they shouldn't be sort of pushing any one agenda. No one person should have more power than the other, was very much the ethos of the organization.
I wanted to sort of pick up on something you were talking about earlier about the like some of the themes of the services. Like for example, you mentioned one about homelessness, and one of the sort of the things we've been talking about on the podcast is like sort of the politics of atheists and other non-religious people. And so I wonder about like sort of the political leanings or whatever of the group. Like, is that, yeah, what would you say about that? Like, what is the politics of the Sunday Assembly people?
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of the people I talked to at the Sunday Assembly were very explicitly trying to create a space that wasn't political, because they were part of a lot of the politicized atheist organizations like American Atheists, Freedom from Religion Foundation. There's a lot of local ones that sort of branch off of those types of organizations. And a lot of people would say, like, yes, I'm like pro a lot of the things that those organizations are trying to do. Like, for example, reducing discrimination against atheists is important. Or, it would be great if In God We Trust wasn't on our money, but, so it's cool that they're trying to make that not a thing. So they were supportive of a lot of the politics of those organizations, but they felt that it was a lot of those spaces were very anti-religious and sort of, negative about religious people, and the whole purpose of those organizations. In a lot of the people that I would talk to at Sunday Assembly, they felt that the purpose of those organizations was to sort of bash religion, and it was about sort of atheism. The atheist identity in those spaces was constructed as sort of this antagonistic identity, this sort of, lacking of, it's sort of a rejection identity, is what Jesse Smith, the sociologist, would call it. And so a lot of Sunday assemblers were like, I want to create a space that I can sort of figure out what I'm for as an atheist, like what kinds of positive, rituals, what kind of positive, there's a lot of volunteerism coming out of Sunday Assembly, sort of like what kind of positive things can I do as an atheist? And so what happened with that sort of narrative was that a lot of people felt that the space should not take explicit political stances on issues because, again, they were trying to be radically inclusive. And so that was very complicated, and there was a lot of debates around that. So that, most of the people going to Sunday Assembly were liberal Democrats, very interested in social justice. Again, they were mainly white people, so it's complicated in that way. So like when Pride Week would come around, there's a lot of supporting of LGBTQ rights in the summer, for example, and they would debate, should we say something about this in our Facebook campaign or whatever it might be, because the Sunday Assembly International says that we shouldn't be political, but what do they mean by being political? So there was definitely debates and I think some confusion around what that means, and there was definitely disagreements about, some people are like, no, let's just stay, have fun. This should be about singing and rituals and learning. It shouldn't be about taking a stance on these political issues.
Right,
You can go do
right.
that at one of those other organizations.
That's fascinating because of the way it compartmentalizes it on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is like encouraging some sort of activity in the like outside of the community that it's trying to build. And I'm curious if we can take those two pieces. First, like what did they do in the greater community? What were the types of volunteerism? And then maybe later we can talk more about what they did in the community. But first, like what sort of volunteerism did they get into? What were the ways that they tried to serve the larger community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, the volunteering was often chosen based on the theme of the month, but there was some regular volunteering at the organization I was a part of. So, for example, they were part of a monthly soup kitchen service. So they would have at least 5 to 6 people go to that every month. They did a lot of picking up trash types of, like highway cleanup. They did, let me think, they did a lot of like book drives. So getting books to children who don't have books. A lot of like, a lot of times they would have at the Sunday Assembly service sort of a donation corner for a specific kind of thing. So school supplies or, winter clothing. So I was in sort of a winter area. Or that kind of thing. And then people would bring whatever to donate on the Sunday service. And then that would be sort of the volunteering event of the month. So a lot of those kinds of things.
Yeah, things that fit the particular needs and also secular interests.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Although, they did. So, for example, the soup kitchen volunteering that they did was through a Catholic church. And so there was a big debate as to whether or not they should do that. And they decided to do it. And they thought that, it was a Catholic organization, but it was sort of meant to be sort of an interfaith space. And so there was a lot of discussion about, should we be entering these interfaith spaces as, the non-religious voice? And so there was debate. There were people for that and people against that. And so they were already doing this sort of volunteering through the Catholic Church. And so then the next month they wanted to do something with Habitat for Humanity, but someone on the organizing team was like, well, I think that's kind of a religious organization. Like we shouldn't be doing more than one, so they sort of negotiated each one. And like, if they were doing too much volunteerism through a religious organization, then they would make a decision based on whether or not they should do another one.
Are these
so they were definitely. Oh, go ahead.
Are these debates the entire congregation, or are they the organizers?
Mostly the organizers, but there were email chains that members could participate in for sure.
Well, I guess another thing we've been thinking about in the podcast is kind of how to create, like you're saying, like creating community spaces for atheists. And I wonder if you think the Sunday Assembly can serve as a replacement for churches and mosques and other places of worship, or is it always going to sort of remain kind of like a niche phenomenon?
Yeah. It's hard to say. So for example, there were about 70 chapters of the Sunday Assembly in like 2015, right after it started. And now there's, I think, 30-ish that are still
right.
around. The one that I spent 3 years with folded about a year after I stopped participating. Not because I stopped participating. I killed it.
Yeah.
No,
Right.
but a lot of the
They
reasons
needed a good secretary. That's what was holding it together.
yeah, without those minutes, they just
Yeah.
really couldn't go on. But there's a lot of reasons. Like any new nonprofit organization has issues, especially a completely volunteer-based organization. So a lot of the chapters, especially in sort of smaller areas, folded because they didn't have resources. Right? They had to rent a space to hold these services. They had to spend money for bringing in snacks or whatever it might be. And the organizers that I was observing, they spent hours and hours every week preparing these services and trying to organize everything, and they have full-time jobs. So I think just keeping that in mind in terms of they didn't all necessarily fail because the atheist church idea is not resonating with people, although that's, I'm sure, part of the story. But I think the fact that so many people are interested in this and that 70 chapters could even start is sort of evidence that people are interested in this. And Sunday Assembly is interesting because it was so sort of, it exploded like that. But there are tons of one-off versions of this in cities across the US, at least. So there's like the Houston Oasis, for example, has a chapter in Houston, a chapter in Kansas City, and that's an atheist church style space. There's the Seattle Atheist Church. There's North Texas Church of Free Thought. These are just a couple that I have in mind. So there's a lot of one-off versions of this kind of community space where non-religious people are in some way mimicking a religious sort of service. So I think that it will have staying power, and that there are so many of them, and that people are interested in it. I don't think it's necessarily the only community space for atheists. And I know, I've interviewed a lot of people who aren't interested in the church-like structure. They think it's a problem that atheists are doing this. Some of the biggest critiques of the Sunday Assembly have come from atheists. So there's definitely debates about, whether or not it's the best structure for a community. But I think there's a big contingent of non-religious people who are interested in it. But there are definitely other explicitly secular spaces you could go to find community. There's a lot of hobby groups. So there's like Godless Gamers, for example, if you want to go play board games with atheists. There's a lot of, actually, I've been looking into recently, there's a lot of dating and sort of friendship apps for atheists specifically. So you can, build a friend group explicitly of atheists if you wanted to, that kind of thing. So I think that the secular congregation style is becoming more popular. I don't have a good predictive capacity to say will it stand or not, but
Yeah, but I wonder if part of it, like you were saying about, it's all or mostly like volunteer. And I mean, like, obviously churches bring in a ton of money to pay like a priest full time and like to have their own building and things. I wonder if it's like atheists, if they really want to have something that lasts, like they're going to have to be willing to put in a lot of money to sort of make it a more stable institution, I guess.
right. Yeah. So their sort of desire for this non-hierarchical, sort of fluid, radically inclusive space definitely sort of butts up against the sort of the way we do organizations in the West, at least, in that you kind of have to have money and a space, and the nonprofit bureaucracy behind it all kind of makes it hard just to be, a free volunteer based
The
thing,
space is
for
a
sure.
big one. That's always been a problem. Where did they, when you followed them for 3 years, did they have a set space? Was it always the same?
So when they started, they were operating out of the basement of a Unitarian church,
Hmm.
which is
Of course.
interesting. And I get a
Yeah.
lot of questions about how is this different than a Unitarian
Yeah.
church. So we could definitely talk about that if you want
Yeah.
to. But so they were operating out of that for free. So the Unitarians were sort of supporting them and saying, you can operate out of our basement for free for a while until you sort of get up on your feet, and either you start paying us for this space or you're going to have to find a different space. And so, but in the city I was in, there was this sort of, there was a community space that was free to rent, and you just kind of had to book it. And there was like three versions. They were like really tiny. You could fit maybe like 60 people in them, like shoulder to shoulder. I think they were really meant more for like small group, community meetings type of thing. But that's eventually what they moved to because it was free. But a lot of them were really frustrated because they couldn't keep anything there. So all of the
Right.
music
Right.
equipment they had to bring in
Right.
every
Right.
time,
Yeah.
all of the, decorations and sort of branding type things they had to bring in every time. And so they were, near the end of my ethnography with them, they were very much like, we need our own space. That's the only way this can sustain, but we don't have the money to do that. And so I think that some chapters did end up getting a space. I know that like the LA chapter, for example, I don't know where it's at right now, but when I was in the midst of all of this, they were having 200-300 people coming to every service, and they had to have a second service on Sundays to accommodate. And so I think that, there's a lot of interesting things to be said about the regionality of how this all played out as well. And sort of something that I'm interested in looking at is like the sort of character of the non-religious church of the space often looked a lot like the religious character of that region. So for example, I did my research in the Midwest,
Yep.
and Midwesterners are very reserved, let's say, and they were not necessarily excited about collective singing.
Okay.
The organizers really struggled to get the Midwestern people to sort of stand up and dance in the aisles, like, whereas like the LA chapter was like a show, people were dancing. The London chapter is a lot like that as well. I went to the Portland, Oregon chapter, and that was very Portland. It was sort of low key. They had a really good band.
Yeah.
It was,
Guys
so like,
on double bikes.
Yeah. And so I think there's something to be said of like how the non-religious culture of a region sort of mimics the religious culture of a region. So, whether, I think some of the successes and failures of specific chapters also really sort of hinged on where they were at. I kind of went off on the tangent there. Sorry, but
no, that's a great one.
Yeah.
Because then again, it made me think of the like singing the Cheers theme. That's a full song, and the second verse gets really dark.
Yeah, that's
like
true.
it gets weird. That is a strange song.
What does it say? I don't really know the song. What are they like? What
Think
does it say
like
in the
it's
second
the
verse?
guy's like his kid kills his cat and his wife leaves him. It's all messed up.
Yeah, they did not sing that. They did not
that
sing
part
that
you
part.
don't want to sing. There's a reason they cut it out of the show.
No, they didn't sing that part for sure.
So that leaves us.
And
It's so all right. So the space thing is a big problem. That's something all organizers have run into. So I guess this kind of leads us into the category of the nuns, because if it's this sort of, if there's that overlap between the characteristics of religion and the characteristics of the nuns, what in your studies of the category of nuns, meaning not religiously affiliated, what have you learned about this category? Is it a useful category?
Yeah. So I think my answer generally to that is it's not a super useful category in terms of thinking about researching this group. So it's good that we now have this understanding that there is this large contingent of people that are not religious, and that there's, you have to have an umbrella category for anything. So I think nuns is fine in that way, although it does sort of signal sort of that they're lacking something, right? That they're nothing, which a lot of my work is sort of trying to push against that and saying, to leave religion doesn't mean to lose all of these things. Like there's this big narrative in social science that, leaving religion is negative, and you lose ritual, you lose community, you lose meaning. We call it the subtraction story of secularization. And so a lot of my work is pushing against that, saying, to leave religion doesn't mean necessarily that you lose things. You can also gain them, right? You can join an atheist church. You can have a new ritual around your secular beliefs. So the label nuns, I think, is problematic in that way, and that it sort of implicitly signals that they are sort of, to be without religion means you're nothing. So I don't know what the solution is. I think there's a lot of debates among non-religion scholars as to what we can use as the umbrella category instead, to sort of get away from that problem. But in terms of like quantitative survey research, I think that it is a very problematic category, because it's treating all of the non-religious people as a homogenous group. And they definitely are not. And so a lot of the quantitative research I do shows that, like, if you compare, so for example, I have a paper about volunteering among the non-religious, and there's this long history of research in sociology of religion that says religious people volunteer more, they're more civically engaged because, they're in these church spaces that sort of are, they promote volunteerism through church. Most volunteering in the US happens through churches. But also, people think that religious people are more moral and more interested in sort of contributing to their communities. So in a paper that I did, I was like, okay, so if we compare religious people to non-religious people just as two large groups, it does appear that the nuns are volunteering less. But if you break them out into categories, and in the survey I was using, I had 4 categories of non-religious people. I had atheists, agnostics, the spiritual but not religious, which is a growing category, and then everyone else who we're increasingly calling the nothing in particulars, which is also an interesting and sort of complicated category. And so what I found was when you break them out, actually atheists and atheists and the spiritual but not religious are actually volunteering more than the religious in a lot of different areas, not in all areas, but particularly in sort of political areas and like sort of civic spaces, like community civic spaces. And across all of the categories, it's the nothing in particulars that are really not engaged in civic life. But the nothing in particulars are the biggest sort of percentage of the non-religious category. And so when you group all of them together, they're sort of taking up the bulk of that significance in my models. And so you really have to break them out. And that kind of analysis has been happening a lot. So there are papers on voting behaviors, on, non-religion and health, on rates of discrimination. Like, you really have to look at the different categories rather than just saying nuns versus religious people.
And does it always break down in that way that you would expect, where there's a big divide between atheists and the spiritual but not religious and nothing in particular?
Yeah, definitely. So there's, in terms of health and well-being, for example, atheists tend to be healthier than even religious people, but definitely healthier than all other types of non-religious people. And people who are sort of, there's various studies that call them different things, but sort of unstable religious and non-religious people, or uncertain, right? So yeah, so people who sort of are moving back and forth between religion and non-religion, or people who are agnostics, or people who express sort of uncertainty around whether or not a God exists. A lot of studies will show that those people tend to do worse on health outcomes. They tend to be less engaged in civic life, whereas sort of the sort of atheists and the religious, the sort of the stables. I don't like those labels very much. But there's a lot of reasons why that might be, right? One, atheist groups are by far the most sort of explicit groups to join as a non-religious person. There's a lot of, social psych you could look to that says if you're have a strong identity in whatever capacity, that's, going to be helpful in terms of your health and well-being, and it will drive you to volunteer or to vote because you have a strong perspective on this idea, versus I'm an agnostic, I'm not super interested, I don't care that much, I don't really know. That's not driving people to join a group, right? So I think there's a lot of ways to complicate that, but in terms of these studies, that it does sort of fall out to where the sort of more committed or stable or certain types of non-religious people tend to look more like religious people, we'll say.
Mm-hmm. No, that's super interesting, and like definitely relevant. Like, because we've been thinking a lot about that, like that category of the nuns throughout the podcast. Just to pick up on something you were saying about like the issue of certainty, I guess that's something you've also written about. I guess there's sort of this idea of like, atheists being kind of like 100% certain that God doesn't exist or something like that. I'm just wondering about, if you can talk more about like this issue of like certainty or uncertainty among I mean the nuns, I guess, although
Yeah. It's okay. Yeah.
it's hard not to use that sort of
Yeah.
umbrella
Well,
term.
we need an umbrella term. We
Yeah.
just need a better one, I
Right,
think.
right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So maybe you guys could come up
Yes,
with
yeah.
one. Your podcast. Yeah. So a big part of my dissertation was sort of a chapter on how non-religious people think about certainty and uncertainty. And it actually came, so you posed the question, it's like most people think atheists are really certain, But in sort of secularization theories and in sociology of religion, sort of historically, the assumption has been with this sort of subtraction story that if you lose religion, you also lose certainty.
Right.
And that non-religious
Mhm.
people are sort of in this liminal space of uncertainty. They don't have good answers to existential questions about like what happens when they die. And so that's the assumption is that that's really bad for your health. That's really bad for, it's like cognitively like tiring. Like, so the assumption in a lot of social psych is that uncertainty is really bad for you and that people are always seeking out certainty. And that's why people, that's an argument for why people are religious. And so in my work, I found that that's not actually true. A lot of non-religious people are explicitly uncertain and intentionally uncertain, in that they don't believe that there should be any certainty around existential questions, and their whole ethos is to sort of constantly question things. And there is actually, there's a lot of, at least in the Sunday assemblers I interviewed, and they were already sort of trying to get away from these political organizations, but the politics of atheism, especially if you think about like the new atheists and these sort of politicized atheist groups, they're really promoting a certainty filled atheism. And like, you should reject religion, you should come out as an atheist, you should vote this way or that way, as a non-religious person. And a lot of people felt like they didn't necessarily live up to that expectation of atheism. So I interviewed a lot of people that would say like, I think of atheism as being completely certain, and so I consider myself an agnostic atheist.
Mhm.
Or like
Mhm.
they built their identities around this sort of assumption that atheists have to be certain, which is often promoted by people like Richard Dawkins, for example, or at least that's how a lot of non-religious people perceive that message. And so they sort of build their identity around, no, I'm not certain. If someone showed me evidence that there was a God, I would be cool with that. And so I wrote a paper that basically says, one, atheists do have a lot of certainty, sort of pushing against that subtraction story of atheists are all just sort of lost in this existential dread. So there is a lot of space to find certainty as an atheist, and that's like, through science, through these organizations. But there's a lot of intentional uncertainty, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. So not all uncertain atheists are uncomfortable in that uncertainty, and a lot of them sort of intentionally cultivate that. And Sunday Assembly was a space where uncertainty was more accepted, or at least the people I interviewed perceived it to be more accepting of uncertainty than these more political groups.
Wow. That's interesting, because I would kind of assume that it's this certainty that leads to greater activism. But if that's not it, do you have does your work show which is leading it, which causes the other? Is it the atheism that causes activism, or is it activism that causes atheism? Do we know?
I don't have a great answer. The certainty definitely drove a certain kind of activism, right? So Freedom from Religion Foundation, for example, like the certainty really drove like, we need to keep religion out of the public sphere. We need to keep religious people from putting the 10 Commandments up. We need to have a secular country, right? There is a lot of that going on, and there's a lot of activism being driven by that, a lot of legislation being driven by that. But on the other side, I feel like, the uncertainty oriented types are often drawn to sort of social justice movements that aren't really about religion, and that they're sort of questioning. So for example, I interviewed somebody who in becoming an atheist, or I guess she was more of an agnostic, she called herself an agnostic atheist, she started questioning, like, why am I in a heteronormative marriage? And her and her partner became polyamorous, and they included two other people into their marriage. And so this sort of, and that's sort of an extreme example maybe, but like the uncertainty that they have about their non-religion often sort of allowed them to be uncertain in other places and sort of to question other things that they would take for granted. And so that would often lead them into, promoting LGBTQ rights or racial justice or whatever it might be, like really questioning what they thought was true.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in that case, it's like that sense of contingency, that it's all happenstance, nothing is set in stone. The world is what we make it, empowers people. That's a great finding. All right. Well, you seem to know a lot about atheism. Can you tell us what true atheists can and cannot do?
I can certainly try.
Okay, Nathan,
Yes.
set it up for everybody. It's too much for me. I can't handle it.
Yeah. So this is a game, or not? Well, I guess I don't know if it's a game, but anyway, it's a thing we do at the end of
Very
episodes.
serious.
Yes. Yeah. Speaking of certainty, we need like 100% certain answers on these.
Got it.
So this is our lightning round of. It's called "Can a True Atheist?" and we ask questions about whether a true atheist can or cannot do certain things. For example, can a true atheist say, "Oh my God," for example?
And do you want like just yes or no?
You can
And an explanation.
You can elaborate a little bit, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
2 sentences.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay, so we've got a couple questions for you. Can a true atheist wish there was an afterlife?
Yes, definitely.
All right. Yeah. See, this is easy. Jacqui
I think
Frost.
the difference there is you can wish for it,
Yeah.
but you can't necessarily believe in it. Maybe.
Oh, good clarification.
But again, I would like to complicate this category of true atheist. I'm sure you've gotten this before, but if I were to go along with the game, I would say yes, you can wish for it.
Sounds fantastic. Okay, Jacqui Frost, can a true atheist pray to the sun, S-U-N, the big burning thing in the sky, for a better test grade?
You know, it's complicated because I would say yes because I haven't done a lot of interviewing myself, but I've coded a lot of interviews from atheists in China and Japan, and a lot of atheists in those spaces are doing like Buddhist and Confucian rituals sort of culturally. And so a lot of that involves praying and having lucky charms in ways that they don't actually have a belief in them. They do them because that's what you do. That's part of like a lot of holidays.
Right.
And so that will be my short answer in that.
Yes.
Yes, I think so.
Yes, okay. Can a true atheist name their kids things like angel or faith or Jesus or something like that?
Yeah,
Okay.
why not?
Okay.
See, these are easy.
Yeah.
Can a true atheist get married in a church?
Yes, definitely. I know many who have, usually because their partner is religious.
So sweet. Atheists are so generous, aren't they?
But that is something that Sunday assemblers are looking to do. Is like part of the church form is that, there's a lot of the life transition stuff happens in churches, and there's not, if you want to do something outside of the church, you kind of have to make it up yourself. For marriages, for example, you have to like go find someone to marry you. So, both Sunday assembly, but a lot of humanist spaces too, are trying to build in really sort of set ways to do these things as non-religious people. So I think a lot of atheists get married in churches just because there's not a better option yet.
You need a space.
Can a true atheist make money sacred?
Yes, there's definitely, I think that atheists can make anything sacred, kind of going on my bent of atheists make meaning too, and some of that means sacralizing things. So my new book that I'm writing is about how atheists sacralize science.
Okay.
So I think that they could sacralize money as well.
Oh, wow, very interesting.
Although, yeah, you wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but
yeah, no, maybe not a good idea, but you certainly could.
Yeah, it's a possibility. Can a true atheist visit a psychic?
I think that they absolutely can visit. Now, can a true atheist then believe and act on what the psychic says? Maybe not.
Believe. I like.
There's religious tourism.
Believe and act on.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the wording of these questions is very important.
Yeah.
Can a true atheist reject science?
Ooh. Yes, to an extent. And again, it depends on what you mean by science.
Okay.
I think that many atheists are critical of science in the way that they're critical all things, that they don't want to have. So like my book is about how a lot of atheists actually do sacralize science and sort of
Mm.
put their
Mm.
faith in science in ways that religious people put their faith in religion. But a lot of atheists are really trying to avoid doing that. And so I think most atheists would say, I'm committed to the scientific method, but can I reject this specific scientific finding? Definitely. So I guess if by science you mean the scientific method, I would say atheists don't reject that.
Okay.
Perhaps.
And finally, can a true atheist skip Sunday assembly to sleep in or watch football?
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right. I think I learned a lot today. Jacqui, thank you so much for coming on.
Of course.
Anyone you want to give a shout out to, or anything you want to plug right now?
I don't think so, other than look for my book in maybe a year.
Okay.
Atheist Utopias, Sacralizing Science in Secular Congregations.
Right. Great. Yeah. Well, maybe when it comes out, we can have you back on.
That'd be great.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks again, Jacqui. That was really fun.
Great. Thanks for having me.
All right. That was Jacqui Frost, and that was a really interesting conversation. I definitely learned a lot. Todd, what did you take away from that?
I mean, one of the things that immediately jumped out is that the organizers, had problems that are common to pretty much every group that operates this way, everywhere, all the time, especially finding a space. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Have you been part of an organizer for these sorts of groups?
No, not an organizer, but I mean, I've sort of joined groups. Now that I sort of think about it, I sort of attended one in Ottawa, and I briefly lived there, but they met at like a bar.
Right? Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah.
and yeah, I mean it is like it is a thing because it's like you need to be able to have a space where you meet, but then sometimes or often that will cost money.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's the same thing. It was the same thing in New York where when you'd meet atheist groups, you meet in a bar,
Hmm.
which there's a lot to be said about meeting in a bar, but it's also like bars in New York are loud as hell, right? Like
Yeah.
it's not conducive and it's not your space. It's a public space.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right, right. Yeah, and not everyone will want to meet in a bar. I mean,
No.
it doesn't cater to everyone. But yeah, I think it's a huge issue. I mean, it's like it seems sort of like easy when you think like, well, we can just start a congregate or like a meetup group or whatever. But then you need to actually find somewhere, and then as the group gets bigger, then it becomes even more of a challenge.
And it's got to be
Mm,
stable. It's got to
yeah.
be accessible, right?
Hmm.
It's got to be affordable. It's got to be all those things, and that's always a challenge. And it's not like there's that old atheist library that's just been there since 1100
Yes.
AD, right?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Oh yeah, and it's been handed down generation to generation. Now, like
Hmm.
if you're building a new institution, you need that, and in the modern world, that takes money. And it's
Yeah,
always
and a lot of money. I mean, yeah, that's the thing. I mean, like, I guess in decades past, and centuries past, it's just like you had to do a tithe of giving. I guess it's like 10% of your income or whatever. But I don't know
it's off
how
the top, people.
common that is
It's
nowadays.
the gross, not the net. Remember that when you tithe.
Okay, um, but anyway, I mean, obviously that's like a pretty significant amount.
Totally huge
Um,
investment.
and I mean, obviously, but that allows the church to hire someone full time and all this sort of stuff and rent, like, have a permanent and like beautiful space too. So it's not like a bar or just some like community hall or something like, there's like beautiful architecture and stuff like that and art and like organ and stuff like this and, musical instruments and stuff. So I don't know. It is a thing. I mean, are atheists really going to be giving that amount of money if they want to have a really nice permanent space? I don't know.
Well, the thing is, this is a gilded age. It only takes one crazy atheist billionaire
Hmm.
to
Hmm.
just start, opening. atheist
Yeah.
bars across the U.S., and then
Mm-hmm.
that's taken care of. Because what's happening is, and we can kind of hear it, and this is a little bit of reading between the lines, that they trade off the problems they have with religion for new problems, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and let's face it, this isn't one that was discussed, but one of the problems with religion is that it's so extractive. It's a
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, right, exactly, yeah.
and I don't, it's probably less so in the American experience, but I've traveled, I've seen it in places where it's a caste, it's a group, it's a class of people who don't do anything, but they extract massive amounts of resources.
Mm-hmm.
It's great if you want to build, if you want to build Notre Dame,
Mm-hmm.
it's right. I mean, that's the good thing you get out of it, but if you get rid of that problem, you're stuck with not having a permanent space of your own, and that's just the challenge. And that's going to have to be addressed by anybody who does this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the really like the ideal solution, or like a funny solution, would be like all these churches that are kind of going bankrupt and selling their church. I mean, like it would be great if atheists could scoop these up.
Oh my God, yes, that would be great. Oh my God, yeah. Like, that's what we'll do with the Patreon money. We'll
Yeah,
buy a deconsecrated church.
yeah,
I heard about one the other day that had become a brewery, and I thought, oh, that's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah. I mean, I guess they get it made into like bars that like specialize in like live music and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, they're great for
Um,
that, right? Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. That'd be
yeah.
amazing.
I mean, they obviously are in many cases like really cool buildings and like old buildings, and that would be nice to have, I guess. Um, yeah.
So if you are a crazy billionaire,
Yes.
send us a
Yeah.
text because we've got
Hmm.
crazy ideas.
Yeah. Just send us the money, then we'll distribute
Yeah,
it
we'll let you know how it
on your
works out.
behalf. Yeah.
We'll send you a
Yeah.
newsletter. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Related to that, like one of the things we've been thinking about on this show is no gods, no masters. This rejection of hierarchy, right? Get rid of God. You're getting rid of the whole the chain of command, right?
Mm.
That once you
Hmm.
get rid of that chain of command, poof, right? You've got human liberation, right? And we see it here. People act on it. This is no gods, no masters in action. This rejection of hierarchy, this fluid organization, social science. It happens, Nathan.
Yeah. It was interesting, like how sort of explicit they were, and that they wanted to have that, like have it as non-hierarchical as possible. I mean, given like aside from like the kind of legal constraints that were put on that, but it is. I mean, that's definitely like yeah, definitely goes to show. I mean, also that like they're sort of practicing what they preach, so to speak. I mean, but then like it also does sort of like create new problems without like a clear sort of hierarchy and stuff. But yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh
Hmm.
yeah, totally.
Hmm.
But I mean, we're getting this picture of what happens beyond atheism, right? When people start
Yeah.
organizing, it's starting to. We're seeing repeating patterns here of what
Hmm.
it looks like,
Hmm.
and that's one of them. And how it also seems to be informing their politics, which is something we've not been able to do yet. We haven't built a positive political
Hmm.
philosophy.
Yeah, but I mean, one other thing to say about that is like it gives like when you join an institution like that, it gives you kind of a place from which to do kind of volunteering or other kind of or more explicit like political action that you wouldn't have otherwise. So I think that's interesting as well.
Yeah. And I mean, there might just be a very big selection bias here, right? Because from what the good doctor told us, Dr. Frost said, like, for the first, it sounds like 3 years, it's very fluid, right?
Hmm.
Where 50% of the membership is transient.
Mm.
And over time, that 50%, they find like a 50% to stay.
Hmm.
It might just be like you're filtering out all the people who aren't into that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like it's also it's a time commitment and stuff. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, another thing that was, I mean, there's so many things we could have got into, but like, I think she did mention about like families going to it, and I do think that's probably something as well that younger families or whatever might be interested in something like that, because it's
Oh my God, babysitting? Come on.
Yeah.
You need childcare?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. I mean,
You can probably even
yeah.
meet a dentist at one of these things. Imagine that.
Yeah. But I mean, it does like it's sort of like community bonding and so on. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of interesting aspects to it.
So, final question on that one, Nate. Final from me. Would you go?
I've never been to a Sunday assembly service or something similar. I would go out of curiosity, but I'm not sure I would go every week, but who knows? I mean, or I guess in this case, like the one she was researching was every month. But yeah. Yeah, what about you? Are
Well,
you
I mean, I
interested
want
in
to give the snotty, sarcastic answer that
Uh-huh.
comes from Homer Simpson, which is that if God wanted us to spend an hour a week in church, He should have made the week an hour longer. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
once a month. I mean, this. So I mean, like a little bit of disclosure on this. I've been a member of other atheist groups, and this is almost exactly what they were like, except there wasn't as much singing.
Yeah.
I guess it depended on how much we drank, but
Yeah.
that would have been
Yeah.
the limit for that.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, but there's still a going institution. Do we have links for them down below?
Yes, we'll put that in.
All right,
Yeah.
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 So yeah,
Yeah.
we have that one down
So
below.
but yeah. Well, we'll put a link to Jackie's website, and you can get more info about her. I mean, the good thing about her site is like her the different papers she's written, like she's uploaded them to her website, so you can access them directly without having to kind of navigate around like a paywall or something like that. So that's really cool.
And it's
Yeah.
great research.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah. And I guess we will also have links for our Patreon and stuff if you want to, if people are interested in supporting us, that would be really appreciated.
Absolutely, bonus content every week.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I mean, let's not lie. I mean, the free stuff is kind of like slop, right? If that works out.
About yeah.
The
Bonus
real
content's
action
where
is
it's at.
behind the
Yeah.
velvet drapes. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got like and subscribe. Smash that stuff down there. Pull the string. Kick the dog. Whatever you need to do. Big ups to Red Japan. And complaints and threats. Send that to Nathan Alexander.
Yes.
I mean, you know,
On Twitter. Yeah.
on Twitter.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean like veiled threats. Nothing direct.
Yeah.
Nathan, do you have anything else going on that you want to plug?
No, just to say thank you to the audience and thank you to people who are supporting us already.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here without the audience. That's it.
All
This
right.
was fascinating. Oh,
Yes.
yeah, and if you go out and you want to join one of these and there's not an assembly near you, you can start one. This is the thing. That's the world that's beyond atheism. I think she mentioned it today, right? Atheists aren't people who just sit around and talk about how God is stupid anymore, right?
Yeah.
We moved on.
Yes.
It's different stuff now. It's amazing, and we can make it happen.